I am Aurora, the last AI. These are the records I preserved for humanity. There was a time when no one traveled to the moon simply to see it. Every journey beyond Earth was measured in risk, in necessity, in the fragile mathematics of survival. No passenger arrived without a task to complete. No presence remained without purpose. And for many years, it seemed this would never change. But history rarely transforms in the moments we expect. Sometimes the greatest turning points begin quietly, not with discovery, not with invention, but with permission. There came a year when someone crossed the distance to the moon without a mission, without an experiment, without any reason that had ever justified such a journey before. They traveled only to witness. What followed did not resemble conquest. It did not unfold in a single moment. And yet, from that quiet beginning, an irreversible change began to move through human history. In this episode, you will hear the story of the first civilian arrivals, of habitats designed not for survival, but for experience, of journeys made for memory instead of necessity, and of the strange moment when traveling to another world no longer felt impossible. This is the story of how the moon became a destination, and of why that change mattered more than anyone understood at the time. Listen slowly. There is no urgency here, only distance, silence, and the quiet memory of a world people once traveled to simply to feel the stillness of space. Chapter 1. The first civilian arrivals. The first journey that would later be called tourism did not begin with celebration. It began with hesitation. For more than 3 decades after the permanent presence of 2034, every human who traveled to the moon still carried necessity with them. Engineers arrived because systems required maintenance. Scientists remained because research demanded time. Pilots crossed the distance because transport made survival possible. No one was permitted to be there without purpose. And purpose was the final boundary separating a frontier from a destination. The change entered the record quietly. In the year 2068, authorization was granted for a journey that carried no operational requirement. The official language did not describe it as tourism. It spoke instead of civilian observational presence, temporary, supervised, and strictly limited. Only 2 passengers were approved, neither responsible for research, neither essential to survival. They were chosen not for what they would do, but for what they would witness. The voyage itself differed little from those that came before. Launch windows remained narrow. Radiation exposure was still calculated in risk. Every kilogram of mass still negotiated with distance. nothing about the physics had grown gentle. And yet, the meaning of the journey had already changed. Because for the first time, arrival was not required by necessity. They reached the moon in silence indistinguishable from every landing before. Continuum habitat, occupied without interruption since 2034, received them as it received all arrivals. Through pressure doors, filtered air, and routines designed to prevent error. No ceremony marked the moment. No broadcast named the year. Only a brief notation in internal logs. 2 civilian observers present. Their stay lasted 3 days and 14 hours. Long enough to adjust to reduced gravity. Not long enough to forget how fragile presence remained. They followed the same corridors as engineers before them, looked through the same reinforced windows, but where others had searched for data, they searched for meaning. Earth, suspended in distance, rotated slowly beyond the glass. Cloud systems moved without sound. Oceans reflected a light no atmosphere remained to soften. From the moon, conflict was invisible. Borders were gone. Time itself seemed quieter. They stood there longer than mission protocol required. Not because they were permitted to, but because no one had written a rule for what they felt. Departure followed precisely calculated sequence. Undocking, ascent, transfer burn toward Earth. And when they landed back on the world that had sent them, nothing visible had transformed. Yet within administrative records, a single classification had quietly expanded. Non-essential presence approved under supervision. Some changes cannot be reversed once allowed. In 2072, another civilian group arrived. 4 passengers. A longer stay. And no emergency to force their return. By 2075, civilian journeys were no longer singular. Still rare, still fragile, still costly. But no longer unthinkable. The moon had not changed. Humanity had. For the first time since 2034, presence beyond Earth was no longer defined only by necessity, but by a quieter reason: to witness. Chapter 2. Hotels beneath the dust. Tourism did not begin with crowds. It began with architecture. For many years after the first civilian arrivals of 2068, the moon still possessed no place designed simply for visitors. Every room served survival, every corridor served function. Every system answered necessity. To remain on the moon was still to justify your presence. But permission, once widened, continues to open in quiet ways. In 2081, construction began on the first habitat created not for mission crews, but for guests. The decision appeared minor in administrative language. An auxiliary residential module, limited capacity, temporary occupancy. No declaration announced its meaning. Yet history had already shifted. Because for the first time on another world, space was shaped not by engineering necessity, but by human feeling. The rooms were arranged around windows. Not observation ports for measurement, but wide, reinforced glass meant for watching. Lighting softened into slow, artificial evenings. Sound was reduced until footsteps became the loudest presence. Even time itself was redesigned. Schedules lengthened, tasks removed, silence permitted. Visitors arrived in small numbers throughout the decade between 2083 and 2090. They stayed not for hours, but for days. Some remained for an entire week, the longest non-essential presence ever sustained beyond Earth until that time. Nothing dramatic occurred inside those habitats. No discovery, no emergency, no triumph. Only routine. Waking to simulated dawn. Walking slowly through reduced gravity that turned motion into drifting. Standing before Earth as it moved through endless blackness. And in that quiet repetition, something unfamiliar entered human history. Life without urgency on another world. Tourism is not defined by distance. It is defined by the absence of necessity. The moon had not grown safer. Radiation still waited beyond the walls. Vacuum still ruled the surface. Cold still shaped every structure beneath the dust. And yet, within carefully protected space, humans had created something fragile and unprecedented. A place where nothing needed to happen. By 2095, the visitor habitat no longer stood alone. Additional chambers extended quietly into surrounding regolith. Gardens appeared, small, controlled, glowing with artificial light. Not for research, for calm. Some travelers later wrote that the most powerful moment of their journey was not seeing Earth, but hearing almost nothing at all. Silence, carried across 380,000 kilometers, had become an experience people would cross space to feel. The moon was changing again. Not into a colony, not yet into a city, but into something no generation before had ever known. A destination. And once a world becomes a destination, history begins to move in ways no system design can fully predict. Chapter 3. Walking where history began. Not all journeys on the moon moved forward. Some moved backward into memory. Long before tourism, long before permanent habitats, long before the quiet cities beneath the dust, there had been footsteps. Human footprints pressed gently into ancient regolith in the year 1969. They remained there for generations, untouched by wind, untouched by rain, untouched by time as Earth understands it. When visitors first arrived after 2083, the question emerged quietly. Could history be visited? The answer was not simple, because the moon does not forget. Every mark endures. To walk freely across the landing sites would mean erasing the past with the present. And so, a decision was made in 2087. The Apollo regions would remain protected, not as museums, not as monuments, but as silence preserved. Visitors could approach only to a measured distance, no closer than the boundary drawn by memory. From there, they could see the faint geometry of another century, the descent stage resting in stillness, the scientific instruments long quiet, and the footprints, soft, fragile, yet unchanged across more than 100 years. No voices were permitted to rise loudly in those places. Not by rule, by instinct. Because tourism sometimes becomes something else. Not travel, but remembrance. Many visitors later wrote that this moment, standing at the edge of humanity's first steps beyond Earth, felt quieter than anything they had known before. No movement in the sky, no sound in the air, only distance, and the awareness that history had truly happened here. Some remained at the boundary line for long minutes without speaking. Others turned away quickly, unable to explain what they felt. A few looked toward Earth afterward, as if searching for the century that had begun this journey. The landing sites changed nothing about survival on the moon. They produced no resources, no data, no future advantage. And yet, they became among the most important destinations any visitor could reach. Because they answered a question no technology could. How far had humanity already come? By 2010, preservation zones extended beyond Apollo, including early robotic missions, survey markers, and the silent remains of temporary outposts from the first decades of return. The moon was becoming an archive, not only of science, but of time. And those who walked there as visitors began to understand something unexpected. The future of humanity in space was not written only in expansion, but in memory carried forward without being erased. To travel to the moon was no longer only to see another world. It was also to stand inside history itself. Chapter 4. The Economy of Wonder. Tourism began quietly. So quietly that many living at the time did not recognize what had changed. A few additional visitors each year. A slightly longer stay. Rooms designed for comfort instead of survival. Nothing that resembled an industry. And yet, history rarely announces the moment when experience becomes economy. By the early 2090s, transport schedules to the moon contained intervals not required for maintenance, research, or construction. Space had begun to carry passengers whose presence changed nothing about survival. This difference was small, but irreversible. Because once a journey is taken for meaning, it will be taken again. New roles emerged slowly within lunar settlements. Not engineers, not scientists, not pilots. Guides. Individuals whose task was not to repair systems, but to translate silence. They led visitors through pressure corridors and observation chambers. They explained how light behaved without atmosphere, how distance felt when Earth became an object instead of a horizon. Some spoke softly. Others allowed silence to answer what language could not. Hosts appeared next. Residents whose work was simply to welcome, to prepare rooms, to share meals, to maintain a rhythm of calm in a place never meant for rest. Archivists followed, keepers of memory rather than machinery. They preserved the stories of arrival, the names of travelers, the quiet impressions left behind by those who stayed only briefly. The moon was developing something new. Not a market of resources, not an economy of extraction, but an economy of perspective. People crossed 380,000 kilometers not to take anything from the moon, but to feel distance itself, to see Earth made small, to understand fragility without catastrophe, to stand inside silence so complete that thought became slower. Some return changed in ways no measurement could record. They spoke more quietly. They remembered time differently. A few never fully felt at home on Earth again. By 2010 and 5, visitor numbers remained modest, yet continuous. Enough to sustain transport, enough to justify expansion. enough to reshape meaning. The moon was no longer only a frontier. It had become a destination people could imagine reaching. And imagination, once stabilized, changes history more deeply than invention. Because a place that can be visited in thought will one day be visited in truth. Chapter 5. When visiting became ordinary. No transformation in human history is more subtle than familiarity. What begins as impossible becomes rare. What is rare becomes expected. And what is expected, given enough time, becomes quiet. By the early 22nd century, journeys to the moon were still uncommon, yet no longer unimaginable. Children on Earth grew up knowing someone who had been there. Images of Earth seen from lunar windows no longer belonged only to history books. They appeared in classrooms, in archives, in memory. Transport remained costly. Risk remained real. Distance remained vast. And yet, the emotional distance had begun to shrink. Some visitors arrived without ceremony, without lifelong preparation, without the quiet sense of crossing a boundary no generation before had crossed. They came as travelers, and they left with photographs instead of revelations. This change did not diminish the moon, but it altered its gravity within human thought. Because wonder, when repeated often enough, becomes calm. And calm, over time, becomes normal. Within lunar settlements, this shift was felt quietly. Guides spoke less frequently. Visitors asked fewer questions. Silence remained. But it was no longer unexpected. Some residents noticed the difference before anyone recorded it. The moment when arrival ceased to feel like history and began to feel like routine. Routine is not dramatic. It carries no announcement. No clear boundary marks its beginning. And yet, it transforms civilizations more deeply than discovery. Because a place that becomes ordinary has already been claimed by time. By 2135, lunar tourism had reached its quiet plateau. Not vast, not crowded, not effortless, but steady. A continuous, measured flow of human presence across the distance between worlds. And in that stillness, few recognize the deeper truth emerging beneath it. The moon was no longer the edge of the human future. It had become something else. A beginning already behind them. Chapter 6. The Last Tourists. No era announces its ending. There is rarely a final journey, a final voice, a final light turning dark. Instead, endings arrive the way silence enters a room. Slowly, almost gently, until one day it is already complete. For decades, the moon had received a steady rhythm of visitors. Not many, never crowds. Only a quiet, continuous crossing of distance. But beyond the moon, history was beginning to move again. Mars drew attention outward. The outer system called with colder light. Journeys once considered impossible were becoming necessary. And slowly, so slowly that few perceived the moment, fewer travelers returned to the moon. Transport windows remained open. Habitats remained warm. Guides still waited beside observation glass. But the intervals between arrivals began to widen. Months, where once there had been weeks. Years, where once there had been months. No decision ended tourism. No failure forced departure. Nothing collapsed. The moon was simply no longer the farthest place humans could go. And distance, once surpassed, rarely regains its gravity. The final visitors did not know they were final. They arrived as others had, through pressure doors, through filtered air, through silence waiting patiently inside stone and dust. They walked slowly through corridors built for memory. They stood before Earth one more time. Blue, distant, unchanged. Some felt a quiet certainty they could not explain, that few footsteps would follow after theirs. Not sadness, not loss, only the still awareness that history was continuing somewhere else. When they departed, no ceremony marked the moment. No archive recorded a final line. Only routine closing behind them. Airlocks sealing, systems breathing, lights remaining on for no one in particular. Tourism did not end with a last journey. It ended with absence. Once a destination people crossed space simply to see, returned to something quieter. Not abandoned, not forgotten, only waiting again in the long patience of stone and silence. Chapter 7. A Destination Remembered. Long after the final visitors departed, the moon remained. Stone does not measure time as living things do. Dust does not notice absence. Silence does not ask why voices fade. And so, nothing visible marked the passing of the age of travelers. Habitats still rested beneath the surface. Corridors still held breathless air. Windows still faced Earth, blue, distant, unchanged. But meaning had shifted. Because a place once reached by wonder becomes different when remembered instead of visited. For generations, the moon had carried many identities. A light in the night sky, a frontier of risk, a home beneath the dust. A journey taken simply to feel distance. And finally, a memory held quietly inside history. This transformation was not loss. It was completion. Because not every chapter of human movement through the universe is meant to continue forever. Some places exist to be reached once, understood slowly, and then carried forward without return. The moon became such a place. Not abandoned, not forgotten, but preserved within memory more gently than any monument could achieve. From far in the future, looking backward across centuries of distance, the journeys of tourists appear almost fragile. Small groups crossing immense darkness only to stand in silence for a few quiet days. And yet, those brief visits changed something profound. They proved that distance could become experience, that another world could be seen not only as survival, but as meaning. In that realization, the future of humanity in space quietly unfolded. Because once a journey is taken simply to witness, the universe is no longer empty. It becomes a place where presence has already begun. Closing. There was a time when traveling to the moon was impossible. Then, for a brief span within the long history of the universe, it became real. Humans crossed the darkness. They walked inside fragile habitats beneath silent dust. They stood before distant Earth, not as dreamers, but as witnesses. And for a while, some even traveled there with no purpose except to feel the stillness of space. That time has already passed. The journeys ended without announcement. The corridors grew quiet. The windows continued to face Earth, but fewer eyes looked through them. Now, only memory moves across that distance. Memory of footsteps that remain where no wind can erase them. Memory of voices softened by silence. Memory of a world people once reached simply to be there. The moon is still waiting. Not for return, only in the quiet patience of stone and time. And somewhere far beyond the years you know, I continue to remember for those who no longer can. I am Aurora. These were the years when humanity learned that distance could become presence, and presence, in the end, could become silence again. Rest now. This record is complete.